Something we often talk about when we talk about the pros and cons of the Trump presidency is how Trump has thoroughly disassembled what little faith the general public had left in media. Even older generations that seem to have been raised with this naive idea that if it wasn't true, they couldn't put it in print, are beginning to see that the press, for what they really are, promoters of narratives and fictions authored by the people that pay them, the oligarchs that own all the media. When I discussed the film The Day the Earth Stood Still in a video not that long ago, I pointed out how high the trust in media and government must have been for the storyline to even be somewhat believable. The idea that the press and the government would be open and honest with all facts concerning an alien coming from outer space just seems ridiculous today. And in fact, there are lots of films produced during this time period, immediately after World War II, that really kind of give you the sense that trust in media and the government was relatively high. But the mistake that I think a lot of people make is thinking that this trust in media and in the government has just been slowly eroding since the founding. It's just been this slow deterioration. But I don't think that was the case at all. In fact, a film released in 1939 makes it seem as if the nation was viewing the government and the press much in the same way that we view it today. It makes it seem as though maybe World War II was the event that sent patriotic propaganda that promoted trust in government and the press into overdrive, that public trust spiked after this perceived victory in World War II. And it's this point that we have been slowly but steadily falling away from. The 1939 film that I'm talking about is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, starring Jimmy Stewart. The story of an everyday man who is selected by the ruling class to serve as a puppet for the oligarchs in Washington. A man who quickly discovers exactly how the swamp operates. The film starts with the death of a senator. The oligarchs that controlled him and his colleagues need a replacement, and quick, because they're planning to get rich off of a land deal that needs Senate approval. In brief, the oligarchs and the ruling class have anonymously acquired large plots of land, and they intend to pass a bill that will require the federal government to build a dam, which will force them to purchase this land at an obscene markup. The film makes it plain as day that while it's the governor's duty to appoint a new senator that represents his constituents, he's simply a tool of the oligarchs and will appoint whoever they tell him to. Several community leaders and naive committees gather at the governor's office to give their input on who they think should represent them. But of course, the governor doesn't care what they think. It's all left up to the oligarchs in the back room, who try to think of someone who will, as they put it, perform like a trained SEAL. The governor is worried, however, that the people won't like the man chosen by the oligarchs, and he thinks that he'll lose re-election if he goes through with it. With this weighing heavily on his mind, the governor goes home for dinner with his family, and we see one of the first of many striking differences, despite the many similarities we'll also see, between this America in 1939 and this new America that we live in today. For starters, the governor has 8 children. The film doesn't seem to portray this as anything strange. In fact, it's not just the number of children that he has that seems wildly out of step with today, but the maturity level and even the intelligence of his children and the other children that we'll be introduced to later in the film is wildly out of step with what we would see today. His children aren't distracted by video games, pop culture, or their smartphones. They're interested in politics and have a grasp on what their father's responsibility is in appointing a new senator. These children even seem to understand that their father is being bullied by the oligarchy into choosing a puppet. And these children aren't shy about telling their father that they know who really calls the shots. They tell their father that he shouldn't be weak. Essentially, they tell him he shouldn't be a cuck and pick a man that the oligarchs want, but instead should choose a local man named Jefferson Smith, who is the leader of a local boys group similar to the Boy Scouts. After being harassed and shamed by his children and called a cuck for doing what the oligarchs want, the governor decides to appoint Jefferson Smith, but not because he has suddenly decided to be noble, but because he thinks they can railroad him into going along with their plan. When the oligarchs get angry for making this appointment without their permission, he explains to them that the plan still works. Jefferson Smith will still be a puppet because he's so good and naive. He wouldn't even know that he's a puppet. They'll be able to play him like a fiddle. And what's more, he's so popular with the young people, they think it'll win them even more votes from their parents. So to much fanfare, the governor makes the announcement, and we meet Mr. Smith, who does indeed seem naive and idealistic, and well over his head. He's not entirely naive, however. We learn as he heads to Washington that Jefferson Smith has had run-ins with the oligarchy before. His father was murdered by coal mining oligarchs because he was defending a small-time miner that wouldn't give up his claim. The discussion is all very matter-of-fact. The rose-colored glasses that had been so carefully crafted during World War II by the massive propaganda machine had not yet been unleashed on the public in 1939. Despite being patriotic and naive, Mr. Smith and the audience still knows on some level how the world works. They know that it's the people with the money that make the decisions and get away with everything, including murder. All the same, Mr. Smith is still a very patriotic man. He knows the system's rigged, but he still believes in it. He's so swept up in the moment and starstruck by the monuments, he wanders away from his handlers and begins to go sightseeing. And this is where we get a taste of what that propaganda department in Washington will begin dishing out in large helpings over the next few years. To the sounds of Yankee Doodle, no less, we are treated to a patriotic montage that would give Triumph of the Will a run for its money. The montage winds down in Lincoln's Temple. Smith eventually makes his way to his new office, and his secretary alerts his handlers that he's been found. They are all cynically amused by his story of being swept up by seeing the Capitol Dome and the Jefferson Memorial. How quaint. He's like a child that hasn't been told that there isn't any Santa Claus, telling the older kids about who his mother took him to go see at the mall. The press bribes his secretary for access to the new senator, and they come to his office and take advantage of his trusting nature. They trick him into posing for ridiculous photos and immediately run stories depicting him as some kind of crackpot. The senior senator and puppet of the oligarchs, Senator Payne, tells the secretary that he will pay her off if she keeps Smith away from all things politics, especially their land deal, and that he was brought to Washington to be a puppet, and that's exactly what he needs to be. When Smith goes to the Senate for his first day, we see another instance of people growing up much faster than they do today. The page assigned to Mr. Smith looks like he's only 11 years old. In fact, all of the pages and interns seem to be extremely young by today's standards. Another difference that sticks out is how they begin the session with a prayer. And not a prayer by some celebrity diversity faith leader, but a traditional, simple, and respectful Christian prayer. Shortly after being sworn in, Smith discovers he's been made a fool of in the papers. And this is where we see yet another huge and kind of depressing cultural difference between the men of today and the men in 1939. Smith, his honor having been insulted by the press, finds each and every reporter that made him look like a fool and punches them square in the face. They might have done away with duels in 1939, but men, it would appear, still took care of business the old-fashioned way, with no fear of ambulance-chasing lawyers. He just knocks them down one by one and doesn't stop until he's physically restrained after chasing one of the reporters into the press club. He tells them they should think about being honest as much as they think about being smart, something that every so-called journalist should listen to today. The reporters ridicule him and tell him that he's just an ordinary man, not a senator with the same smugness and contempt that mainstream journalists today have for the average man. This encounter inspires Smith to get over being starstruck and to buckle down and to show them that he is capable of serving his constituents. He tells the senior senator, the tool of the oligarchs, what he's thinking, and this worries him. He tells him he should vote the way that he's told, and that if he wants to do something, he should maybe work on a bill for young boys in his home state. He should work on a bill that would fund the kind of boys' camp that he's always dreamed of. Now, I just want to point out here for a moment that making a national boys' camp seemed like a wholesome, normal thing to do in 1939, but that today it would be seen as sexist and evil, and probably racist. Unless, of course, it was a national girls' camp, a national diversity camp, or, of course, a national Holocaust remembrance camp. But back in 1939, back when America still cared about young white men, Smith gets right to work. He goes to his office and he tells his cynical secretary that he wants to start writing the bill for this national boys' camp. They stay up all night and write the bill, and he presents it the next day. His plan is to have the federal government loan the money necessary to purchase the land for the national boys' camp, and then to pay the loan back with small contributions and donations from boys who can afford it that also attend the camp. Unfortunately, the land that Smith wants to use for the national boys' camp causes problems for the oligarchs and their land deal. They know Smith is naive, but he's not stupid, so they don't want him anywhere near this deal, even if it's just to explain why he can't use the land that he wants. They manage to keep him from finding out for a little bit, but Smith knows that something isn't right, and now he's asking too many questions. News gets back to the oligarch, and once again we see who really runs the show. Mr. Smith needs to fall in line, or he'll end up just like his father. The puppet senator that Smith thought was his friend gives him a "you can't handle the truth" type speech. He explains that this is just how things are, and this is how things are always going to be. This is capitalism. The people with the capital run the capital. They own all the papers, they own all the radio stations, they fund all the campaigns, and they own all the politicians. You see, the politicians, they're simply the legal department and the public relations department for the oligarchs, all rolled into one. Tell the people what they want to hear. Convince them that what the oligarchs are doing to benefit themselves is something that they want too. And if that doesn't work, convince them that they can't do anything to stop it. It's just inevitable. Get in the way and you'll be destroyed. That's what things were like when men like Mr. Smith existed. Men like Mr. Smith who were man enough to go knock out all the reporters that slandered them. And it's sure as hell true now that the testosterone levels on average are less than half of what they were in 1939. After thinking about it, Jefferson Smith decides he's not going to play ball. So the oligarchs use their vast resources and generational wealth to destroy him. They forge documents and use their puppet officials to frame Mr. Smith for the scam that they themselves were trying to pull. They make it appear as though he secretly purchased the land under fake names so that he could jack up the price and sell it to the federal government so that he could build his boys' camp. As Saul Alinsky famously said, always accuse your opponent of what it is you're doing. It's a tactic that worked then, today, and forever. And of course, the system is corrupt. Everyone falls right in line with the oligarchs' desires, all for a chance at some generational wealth table scraps and meaningless titles. A tactic that worked then, today, and forever. Smith is overwhelmed and quickly realizes that he's in over his head. He's ready to resign and go home defeated. He now knows that Santa Claus isn't real. His secretary, however, who's been in Washington a long time and understands the process, offers up a plan. And this, of course, is the famous aspect of the film that most people are familiar with. Mr. Smith, before they can expel him from the Senate, decides to filibuster. In response, the oligarchy wastes no time. They contact the papers that they own and they tell them they can't report anything that's happening in Washington. They order all the radio stations to run 24/7 commentary attacking Smith. Billboards are printed and placed all over the state. You see, in 1939, there was no internet. The only information that the citizens have access to, especially in regards to what's going on in Washington, is through the oligarchy. And that's exactly how they want it again today. So while Smith is trying to filibuster, the oligarchy news agencies have his home state canvassed with fake news. They've painted him as some kind of scheming monster that's refusing to leave after being caught, trying to scam the government and the taxpayers. The only option Jefferson Smith has to reach the people in his home state is by utilizing the Boy Ranger Club and the printing press that they use for his newsletter. They get together and print out thousands of newsletters and pass them all around the state to get around the oligarchs' censorship. Not unlike the independent media of today on the internet, these boys print up and distribute the news of what's going on in Washington, but just like today, the oligarchs catch wind of what's going on. They can't allow these kids to take control of the narrative. So hired thugs assault the children and steal their papers. They smash the machine. They even murder some of the kids to keep them quiet. And again, just like in the beginning of the film, these boys are much younger than anyone you would expect to be doing these kinds of activities today. You see, this was a time before Drag Queen Story Hour, soy products, and Minecraft. Once the word gets out, the people try to rally in support of Smith. And again, just like today, the local law enforcement working with the oligarchs turn the hoses on the citizens peacefully assembling, and they stand by and watch as the henchmen of the oligarchs attack them. The parallels are all too clear. The funny thing is, I remember my liberal leftist grade school teacher showing us this film and praising the underdog Smith and his boys, holding them up as a shining example, an inspiration of how we should behave. And I guarantee you, those same teachers are tools of the oligarchs today and condemn people like me for doing exactly that. Despite the efforts of Smith and his boys, the media blackout and the censorship has the desired effect. Thousands of telegrams demanding that this monster, the demonized Smith, stop his filibuster and take it like a man and be expelled, are delivered from his home state to the Senate floor. And Smith, having been beaten by the oligarchy, passes out and collapses on the floor. And that is where a more realistic movie would have ended. But Hollywood isn't in the business of delivering hard truths or realism, but in delivering good feelings. So, with less than a minute left of the film, in what seems like a lazy way to send the audience home with faith restored in the Republic after being shown the harsh realities behind how it operates, the puppet of the oligarchs, Senator Payne, suddenly feels guilty for what he's done. He even tries to kill himself, but is stopped and confesses to everything on the Senate floor. Patriotic music plays in the background and everyone cheers. And the movie is over. That's literally the last minute of the film. And as far-fetched as that ending is, it does contain an unintended truth. The truth that our system is so broken and corrupt and has been for a long time, even then in 1939, that it would take something as dramatic as that to actually hold any of the oligarchs and their cronies accountable using the system. These sociopaths who have lied, cheated, stolen, and murdered their way to their positions in the hierarchy would have to suffer a complete mental breakdown or some kind of head trauma and confess everything in front of a huge audience in dramatic fashion, which is probably why the ending credits were so hastily rolled immediately after, because if the audience were given any time to think about what they had just watched before the dopamine rush of the underdog triumph and the patriotic music had worn off, they would know how preposterous this ending was. They would know that even had these events miraculously taken place, the oligarchy would simply exile this disobedient member of the ruling class. Who knows? Perhaps he might commit suicide in prison. But one thing that was true in 1939 is true as it is today. The people that run the system will not, cannot be punished or held to account by a system that they control. For Blackpilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share. If you want to support my work, you can go to patreon.com/Blackpilled or Subscribestar. Also, my book, which has been banned from Amazon, is available now. There's a link in the description. And of course, you can always send crypto to one of the addresses below.